Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you for having the possibility just to tell you a little bit about Kigali. That's a topic I've chosen for this presentation. I hope you still can listen to some more input, and maybe we just should think why Kigali, just reflect it a little bit together. I called it the city of hills and wetlands, and I think it's a very good example if we now this afternoon want to reflect a little bit the relationship and the interaction between the city and the landscape it is embedded in. And in Kigali, due to the real physical situation, you can study this kind of interaction, but at the same time you can also study what risk means and disaster means. But maybe it's not only the question of the big disasters, for example, raising sea level is no question there, but it's also about these small-scale disasters, these periodically coming up disasters that cause a lot of trouble to daily life. And so I would like to give you some insights on the situation in Kigali and also refer to a research project we are working in at the moment. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda, and as so many others, it had doubled its population in the last decades and has 1.3 million inhabitants today. And at the same time, it is important just to point out that it has an extraordinary topography that is characterized by hilly terrain and swampy grounds. And this extraordinary topography, it shapes not only the city and causes some very big challenges, but it shapes the whole interior of Rwanda, just giving it the name of Land of Thousand Hills. As a consequence of the 730 square kilometers, up to 50% of the surface of the city of Kigali are ranked unsuitable for construction due to the terrain constraints. That means that there's a big number of very steep slopes, many of them having gradients more than 30%. And there's another challenge we already talked about a lot today. It's the informal settlements. Most of the settlements are informal in Kigali. It makes up to 80%, with dangerous living conditions in sometimes inadequate shelters. You see some pictures, we know them from other situations, from other cities as well, but they are quite challenging for the further urban development in Kigali. So we have this kind of unsafe building situations. We have very big flooding problems. We have heavy erosion problems. But at the same time, I have to point out that Kigali is also very ambitious in future planning. They have quite an exciting master plan, and that this master plan, developed in the last decade as well, it focuses very much on the future role of the wetlands and the swampy lands. And I think this is a very big shift in the awareness of the future urban development and the coexistence with the landscape. Because before, these swampy lands also has been seen as future built-up areas, but the new master plan clearly points out how much these Wetlands can contribute to manage the daily life in Kigali, to contribute to water management, to flood management, to contribute to food production, and to contribute also to the beautification of the city. So that is a remarkable shift in awareness. That does not mean that one-to-one this kind of thinking becomes instructive and everything works in Kigali. But I think it's important just to have this kind of awareness among the decision takers. So here you see again these challenges in the informal settlements, erosion, the limited sewage systems that are existing, the infiltration of grey water, and all these challenging questions we know from other contexts. A second remark that leads to the research project that has brought us to Kigali. And this research project is called Rapid Planning. It's an action-oriented research project that has been developed and funded under the umbrella of the German Future Megacity Research Program. And so we are in the comfortable situation that we have a funding by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research for 5 years, and we just passed through the midterm conference in September this year. What is the idea of the Rapid Planning project? Rapid Planning, okay, you can easily understand that it refers somehow to rapid urbanization. But the challenge we have to deal with, and the ministry asked us to deal with, is to develop a kind of method what future infrastructural systems in rapidly urbanizing regions should be, and whether it is possible to create some synergies between material flows and necessary infrastructures. So we are asked to develop or contribute to develop a method, and we do this in a broad interdisciplinary team with more than 12 partners. And we try to examine, focusing on the infrastructures of water, food, energy, and waste, what adequate systems might be and how they can create synergies and how they can contribute to minimize risk and disasters in the cities. There is the idea to cooperate with so-called case cities. There are 3 plus 1. Plus 1, that's a German city we are cooperating with, Frankfurt. But there are 3 others in very different cultural context and with very different local and climate conditions. So we have a cooperation with Da Nang in Vietnam, with Asyut in Egypt, and on the other hand with Kigali and Rwanda. And these local conditions, they really show us how much the city is referring and relying on the capacity of the landscape it is embedded in and it is interacting with. So we do a lot of investigation on many different levels. One of the components is data collection, quantitative land data collection about the urban structure, about the landscape structure, about consumption patterns for these different infrastructural systems. And it's important to point out that for the first time, food is also seen as an urban infrastructure, and the urban food system is also seen as a part of the urban infrastructure. So we, as a landscape architects in the interdisciplinary team, We are investigating the food systems in the different city regions. And we just heard in one of the presentations of the PhD students that there is this close linkage between the landscape, what we called the rural before, and the city, and that we should be aware a little bit more of these kind of interactions between these two spheres. One key term in this context for us is to assure or to think about food security, just understood as another safety issue within the broader context of risk. Food security, that means assuring physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And for us, this is a big question of just understanding the big flows that are behind the food system and what a city region can contribute to have a more resilient, or let's call it more sustainable, regional food system. And on the other hand, a very new point of view is just to situate food again. That means raise awareness where the food is produced, how it is distributed, where it is consumed, and what are the leftovers. So just to integrate these kind of flow into the understanding of the relationship between the landscape, the rural and the urban spheres within a city region. And the second job we have to do within this broader research context as landscape architects is not only to contribute to data collection and quantitative aspects, but to prepare action on the ground. So we are working within the context of small-scale entry projects. And these entry projects, they just function a little bit as door openers. That means they should generate, contribute to knowledge generation. What are the problems within low-cost, low-income informal settlements? And can we already start to understand their problems and contribute to solve their problems? And that's the first point. The third point I would like to focus on a little bit, the entry project in Kigali. So what is the idea behind the entry project? We have chosen an informal settlement in cooperation with the city of Kigali, the informal settlement of Agatare, which is one of the oldest informal settlements that we have in Kigali. Just remember that nearly 80% of all Kigali is categorized as unplanned and informal. And Agatare, on the one hand, is really in walking distance to the central business district, but on the other hand, it is also related to a wetland that is used for food production. So let's have a short look at the situation in Agatare and the Rwunda wetlands. You can see also a situation you know from many other cities that we have these kind of unpaved streets, unpaved access roads, causing heavy problems during the two rainy seasons that occur in Rwanda. And we have the wetlands at the foot of the slopes, and we have agricultural production by farmers' cooperatives on a very low productive level. And it's a new strategy by the city of Kigali just to give this kind of land to farmers, to new urban farmers that are starting to cultivate it and thus contribute to the urban food production. We don't have a sewage system, or only a very limited sewage system in Agatara, so it's only some rainwater drainage, which nowadays equally is used for grey water discharging. And 90% of the households, they have pit latrines that really perforate the hill like a Swiss cheese, you may say. And there is some forms of waste collection, but it's still under development. And it has to be said that waste collection in a low-income community is not that very attractive if you are talking about waste as a resource. So the communities with higher income are much more attractive to implement these kind of waste collection systems. You may ask why I'm talking about waste now and why to do these remarks, but the waste is strongly polluting the wetlands and causing a lot of trouble for the wetland farmers. And so waste and the infill of rainwater, the flooding by rainwater, but also the infiltration of the grey water is one of the main problems that had been identified between the hills and the wetlands. And we have very heavy problems with the seasonal flooding and the erosion, and sometimes even the schools and the houses are flooded and just making them useless periodically and causing big erosion problems. So what could a research project do within this context? And how did we design our entry project? We try to make these kind of linkages between the landscape and the city more powerful, more interesting in the sense of a sustainable development, but also in the sense of economic ideas for these informal settlement. And so we worked together with the community on a design of this small-scale entry project, just trying to follow a very strict, very clearly structured way of identifying some problems, trying to implement first steps, but then also to monitor it, to evaluate it, and to draw some conclusions for the methods that we have to develop as a bigger task or the bigger frame within the research project. So the identification is a process that took place on many, many levels by doing interviews, by doing some small-scale surveys, but also by bringing students to the field and to do some hands-on projects also to get in contact with the local inhabitants and to do something really together. But this was only or always as a kind of methodological approach is always the first step, just to say we are here and we want to do something and we really want to share our knowledge, your local knowledge and our expert knowledge, and we really would like to work on solutions together with you. One outcome, for example, of this collaborative summer school was the idea to implement small-scale greywater boxes. Another idea that we developed was a school within the area that was heavily hurt by rainfalls and erosion, was to develop a kind of a sponge school concept, just to raise the capacity of the school area to absorb water. Or with the farmers cooperative, we try to find out what are really the needs and limitations they have to deal with, from the topic of pollution that I already mentioned, but also the challenge of having a low productivity and a very big need of further fertilizer that the cooperative, for example, could not achieve. As an outcome of these very many talks, stays, workshops that we did together, there was a common conception of what an entry project within Agataro and the Rwunda wetlands could be and what could be first implementation steps. So as I already mentioned, we started to just improve the absorption capacity of the school by planting vetiver grass together with the students and the whole school team. And besides this, there was some kind of composting training with a farmers cooperative and the testing of the greywater boxes in some selected households. For us, it is interesting just not only try to test these kind of components together with the people, but also to further monitor it, because it's a big question, what might be an adequate scale of infrastructural systems, and what does a decentral greywater management, for example, make sense? Is it possible just to maintain it? Where are the limitations of scale? So it was about a common and a very recursive knowledge production about the appropriate scale of infrastructure components that should be implemented. And it was just summed up in some recommendations and a kind of module catalog that we developed in all the 3 cities as a result of this approach, trying to have a description of what is possible, what is desired, what is asked for, but also what are the limitations. And so by these different components and by the documentation of these different components, we hope to contribute to decision making when looking at the implementation of infrastructural systems in transforming in the upgrading processes of informal settlements. And we are convinced that these infrastructure systems are a key component and a key interface if we want to have a more resilient interaction between the city and its landscape. It's becoming quite obvious for the question of water and food, but also, for example, for building materials and other kind of flows. So the deep description for us is a first step to do a documentation, but also to have a kind of deep description to transfer this kind of knowledge to other cities. We suppose that this could be a step to a kind of new network thinking in the context of infrastructure. Understanding infrastructure not only as technical solutions, but more as a kind of social, natural networks. This means, on the one hand, to understand the interaction between the city and the landscape, but it means, on the other hand, also to overcome kind of sectorial approaches and to integrate a big and huge number of actors, from the ministries to local actors in this kind of problem development, of problem solutions. Just to sum it up as a last point, I think we should not talk about dangerous landscapes. I would like to prefer to talk about social, natural assemblages as a future task. So what we want to learn from the work we are doing is, on the one hand, that we have, of course, a methodological feedback into our own research design, so that we can learn from the micro projects and that these experience on the ground really can feed our methodological approach, because we are also building a digital model for infrastructures, and all of you know that the output of the model depends on what you put in. And for us, it is very important that we overcome these technical approaches and include small-scale approaches as a possible option. And also to overcome this kind of sectorial silo thinking and look for integrated networks. That really means to be aware of the identification of interfaces. For us, it is also a big question, and we are still not able to answer it, and I think many of us are not able to answer it, up to which level it is really fruitful to engage inhabitants, not in the process of what might be a suitable concept, but as an active part of an infrastructural system. So do inhabitants become a node in the infrastructure systems? Will they contribute to empower the system? That is still a big question. And again, for us it's very important not only to think about the relationship between the city, people, practices, and policies, and what are adequate infrastructures to organize the material flows, but also to include the natural components and landscape as actors, and also pay attention to their kind of agency. So just to do this kind of shift from dangerous landscape again to social natural assemblages. My presentation was as colorful as a team that is working on it in very, very many different disciplines. So a very big thank you to all the partners that made it possible to have these kind of results and hopefully make them fruitful for the further development. We just had the midterm presentation on conference in Nairobi together with UN Habitat, which is one of our partners within the project. Those who are maybe interested to get some more information, there is a huge number of presentations for download on the Rapid Planning website. And yeah, a very big thankful for listening to me.